Hello, hello. Oh, you can hear me. Hi, fantastic. I'm doing very small things usually, now changing into bigger things as an architect and artist. Lots of it can be called urban acupuncture or interventions in public spaces from West Bank through Brazil, finishing in US, but also dealing a lot with Polish and German public spaces. But instead of talking about my own works, I will talk about the neighborhood where I grew up. First, I'll go through New York very fast because it's the antithesis. But very fast, why we need polycentricity? The population in cities is growing, and we are seeing growing complexity. Like the cities are becoming more and more sophisticated. So we need to disperse everything, from administrative decisive processes to infrastructure. We spend too much time and money to go to work, school, kindergartens, shopping, etc. Even in smaller cities. Warsaw is about 2 million inhabitants, and our city center is like a big strange fish that is, or a Frankenstein that is actually cut by different historical processes. And already we can see a need for polycentricity as much as a 400,000 people Brno. Large parts of our cities are half-used. We live in overly zoned cities that offer specialized zones of function in specific hours and become dead or non-functioning in other moments. We can see it in many places. We have this this notion of osiedle. You probably have it in Czech. What would that be in Czech? A settlement, osiedle? How do you call it? Like the modernist neighborhoods outside of Sedlice? Sedlice? Sedlište. Okay, so do you know Sedlište in Brno? Are there any Sedlištes? Exactly. And we know how life in a Sedlište looks alike when people are out to work in a place where there's work. We want our cities also to offer good quality of use and good quality of life, not only in some specific zones and not only in some specific moments of time, but more or less everywhere and every time. I won't go through all this. I don't have enough time, but we have different potentials of polycentricity related to history. Either a bunch of villages that grew up to become like Rome or London to become a complex city with already embedded a number of different centers. We have mechanisms of different cities being built close enough, as is the case of Silesian agglomeration in Poland, where we have a number of cities of pretty much the same size that suddenly are close enough to become one big city. But then we have also the case of cities that grew outside of their perimeter, that was the perimeter before communism, for instance, and became much bigger, but still using the same center. What is needed to make polycentricity possible? Network-based organization. So instead of center-based, it's obvious. We need to disperse infrastructure, and we need polyfunctional districts, polyfunctional places. But most of all, we need people. Very differentiated, varied group of inhabitants in different districts who have different lifestyles, who come together and mix. In Eastern Europe, especially, but also here, same in Poland, we are stuck between different remnants of modernist thinking. The basic one is the idea of zoning. Well, we are also stuck between what is the idea of socialist zoning and what is the American idea of programming space. Of course, you probably know some of these places. These are the typologies that also were already shown. So from a very dense medieval city through also dense, let's say, 19th century city block, through modernist monozones or monofunctional zones, and strange spaces outside of the cities, let's say learning from Las Vegas logic, And we are dealing with very different organisms altogether. We have something that is not a continuous city, it's fragments, as you said. And we can go through American zoning with all the craziness of centralization. I'll give you the idea best depicted by the insular situation of Manhattan, which is an island. You can see, this is the subway map. As you can see, a very characteristic phenomenon here is that all lines are going to Manhattan from Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, very rarely through tunnels and bridges going to from New Jersey side. But what's funny is that this was programmed for people to go to work only in Manhattan. So if you want to go from Brooklyn to Queens, and Brooklyn is the most populated part of the city, and you want to go to the adjacent district, you cannot do it, almost. There's one line and it's incomplete. In most cases, you have to go to Manhattan and change in Manhattan. These are varied examples of American cities, how dead they are, or Anglo-Saxon model cities, starting with St. Louis, Louisville, Toronto, Perth, places where I worked, and I was always impressed what's happening after 5 p.m. There was this comedy in the 80s from 9 to 5, and these are zones, the downtowns of the cities, that are totally dead after 5 o'clock, except maybe for pubs where some people would go. Then we have patches of this more socialistic thinking that happened in New York back in the 50s and 60s, which are basically the Alphabet City and Lower East Side, which are monofunctions again, and they're more than that, they're also gated in many cases. We have different typologies that we all know, some denser, like the typical Brooklyn neighborhood, and some with some repetitive mechanistic approach. In each case, it's a reality driven by car, of course. In each case, it's atomized. And then we have socialist example, which is, in this case, I'm using the figure of Warsaw, with a very small, uncomparable, maybe subway system that is, for now, composed out of pretty much 2 lines, which is, one is south-north and the other one east-west. And they're, of course, forming a cross. The funny part is that it's a very efficient, let's call it system, it's a very small thing, but it's also related to a very efficient bus system. Plus, we are developing more and more the bicycle lines. So one of the things that Warsawers cannot complain about, and it's really a rare situation, is the transportation. We really have a good one. This is the downtown that is a tragical effect of history, with the present from Josip Stalin on my left hand, the Palace of Culture, that erased 12 city blocks. As you can see, this nothingness around, including giant parking spots, is the effect of this gesture. We have some leftovers of pre-war Warsaw, but then this is looking up north with Vistula in upper north corner. We see that this is a modernist city when it comes to the downtown. And we have, of course, the phenomena of American parachuted models, like as is the case of Jersey Partnership, the biggest shopping mall in the center of Warsaw, called Golden Terraces. That is absolutely an expression of American thinking. No interaction with the surrounding, totally introverted, not so much car-driven though, because lots of people using it are actually people coming from the adjacent central train station, or people walking. But still, it's a typical effect of American thinking. And of course, we have a number of these outside of Warsaw. We have a number of gated communities. We have all this mechanical stupidity that, again, was glued, copy-paste from other reality. But then I'll tell you about the place where I spent my childhood. And of course, there's an element of nostalgia in it, but I'd like you to imagine that something like this could actually happen in Brno. So we have a huge neighborhood that was built 40 years ago as an effect of a competition. And it was supposed to be an experiment, also a social experiment. The first time, architects were working in Polish history with psychologists, behavioral psychologists, graphic designers, and landscape designers. So it was a multi-talented group that developed Ursynów. And Ursynów is a paradox because we have something that is an effect of zoning, of thinking in monofunctional terms. At the time also with one possible line connecting it with the city center. But then some elements of it are actually potentials, and this is happening now, for a new center. For many Warsawers, this huge part of the city that was planned for 40,000 people, that now is 144,000 people. This is the third biggest district of Warsaw. For many Warsawers, this was always an alien part. This was a city in a city, a totally different logic, hardly connected to Warsaw, totally built with new Plattenbau prefabricated buildings, with huge spaces in between, out of which maybe 50% were done in a very interesting landscaping way, but the other 50% never happened because the money stopped in the 80s. So we had a huge emptinesses in between buildings. You can see the map of districts of Warsaw. So Ursynów is the green patch on the lowest, most southmost part. On the other map, you can see that actually it's encompassing partially a forest, which is also a huge argument for people to choose living there, because suddenly forest is a big argument when it comes to the natural resource. These are different typologies that the young designers, they were students at the time, were using as references. Really very different models, including a classic approach of so-called freestanding pavilions that were supposed to be schools, amenities, shops, you name it, out of which also a very small part was actually built during the communist time, because again the money was lacking and the priority was to provide as many apartments as possible. So people were always complaining about lack of amenities there. And I remember myself, I was transported with a school bus to the city center because there were no primary school with enough places to be there, even though they implemented a model especially of prefabricated schools bought in Sweden called the Swedish module, but still it wasn't enough. Here you can see the bird eye view of the situation with the district. As you can see, there's very different setups. In the lowest part you can see the 90s with much more density, also horrible postmodernistic experiments with pistache and pink facades and you name it. Here you can see it, but the biggest argument and the pro there was the greenery. This was the first time actually people decided to, designers decided to give people gardens, private gardens, when to the adjacent to the apartments. So as you can see, many of public spaces or emptinesses between buildings looked like this. But the paradoxical situation, well, it's a Polish story, it's a Catholic country, yeah. So the first things to engender life were usually temporary wooden structures being voluntarily built churches. And I'll give you an example of one of these. That's the one designed by Marek Budzyński, who was the chief designer of the entire district. As you can see, it's already a different formal language. And it was built for a very long time. And at the beginning was just an emptiness in front. But this is what happened over time. Marek Budzyński has become a sort of designer king of the neighborhood, building a set of different, already different in approach settlements, like or compounds, like this one. He was very much inspired by his Swedish years, but by the subject of ecology. So this is a very classic, boring public space, but still it's this is probably the ersatz of what we would call a good walking. I've seen tons of better places here or even in Warsaw, but again suddenly the amenities and the social functions, smaller shopping places started to emerge in this organic way because of the church. So suddenly something that is Poland and Polish society is a hybrid situation that is partially related to patriarchal countryside and noblesse traditions, including the role of Catholic Church, but also through a very tremendous, dramatic but yet modernizing tradition of socialism. So suddenly we have all these things coming together, including a green ecological buildings. One of the first attempts to build something more green in Poland that are surrounding this very place. The effect is that on the other side of the church, that you can also hear, the first more organized street happened with buildings that are enclosing the Plattenbau structures, creating a street front, something that was not included in the original idea. It was supposed to be freestanding objects in the landscape. So suddenly we're coming back to the idea of a strong street front. This is a mountain done with leftovers from building sites, and as you can see, this has become also a very lively place that lots of people use in different occasions. The tradition of green spaces in front of buildings that started in the very beginning, and you can see that people love it, and there's crazy expressions happening there. This you can see are the first expressions of anything that's the freestanding pavilion. Yeah, so we have the House of Culture, we have a department store with things for kids, we have this beautiful prefab, the shopping mall supposed to be, of course, on kids from the First Communion, and then the change was related also to the fact that the first stops of the subway line were done there, which also produced a lot of changes. And then private sector emerged, ended up doing all kind of silly things. One of the most important parts is also that the new center is getting created by people who are walking there, pedestrians and people on bicycles, because the designers have created a number of ways of avoiding the conflict with the traffic. So people actually can go through almost entire Ursynów without crossing a street or a road. Of course, we have lots of examples of art inserted there, etc. The first, I've been mentioning graphic designers. The first public information on directing people to different places was actually happening there in Polish tradition. So this was the first ground. Ursynów was a political expression of Edward Gierek, who was the Western-oriented prime secretary of Communist Party. Lots of films were shot there. The first IKEA in Poland was opened there, which was like an important gesture. Also, what is interesting is that this is a moment, this year is 40 years of Ursynów. So this is the moment when suddenly lots of people will start to encompass this period, saying that actually many of the pains that people had living there are gone. And the truth is, this has become a place of choice for many young couples with kids, because it provides safety, it provides more and more amenities and public functions, and it provides an incredible amount of greenery. So suddenly things that the generation of my parents could have denied or criticized in 90s, they turned to be a good thing today. And I think the same kind of process can actually take place in this sort of neighborhoods in Brno. Thank you.